What's good, everyone, and welcome back to Kaya's Commentary. And if you're new here, welcome to Kaya's Commentary. This is a podcast that offers commentary on pop culture topics, real world issues, and anything in between. This is episode 2 of my 13-part series entitled Picture This, where I look back at Black, Indigenous, people of color representation in the media and how those past representations affect their presence in science fiction and fantasy genres today. In episode 1, we covered the social concept of race, and the next 5 episodes will be dedicated to looking at race and its effects on 5 BIPOC communities. Those are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and Arab communities. And today we're looking at race and its effects on the Black community. As stated in episode 1, this series contains use of out-of-date language. I feel it is important to not censor myself because I don't feel I can properly talk about the stereotypes, their impact, and their official names from a historical context without using certain words, so viewer discretion is advised. Also, while I strive to be as accurate as possible, these are meant to be brief introductions. People dedicate their whole careers to studying race and its culture and the culture and its intertwining of the two. Even with my BA in theater arts and my MA in mass comm, two arguably research-heavy degrees, I'm still certainly not going to be able to tackle everything in the 30 to 45 minutes that I hope these videos will round out to. That said, I will do my best to make this as informational, engaging, and entertaining as possible. With that, let's get into it. Now that we have an understanding of race and its forming, let's get into its effects on Black people. Because, make no mistake, while race might have once been a concept constructed by man, racism has very real implications. In addition to the inferior stereotype, several others would be bred about Black people and Black Americans. According to UA Literate history professor Barkley, before the Civil War, Black people, while still inferior to whites, are so hardworking.
Many enslaved people had in the United States had this reputation for being very diligent workers. And in fact, and I may have mentioned this, that slave markets often advertised people based on their point of origin in Africa. So there develops these reputations that Yoruba people have this or that trade, or whatever else. And so people would be inspected and sold based on these assumptions about race. And so the stories or narratives about a person from this part of Africa or a person with this skin tone were pervasive, especially in slave markets.
Because of this inferiority, they made great slaves because their minds were only great enough to understand it and their bodies tough enough to endure it. They were simple, yet content. When the abolition movement kicked off, the image of the happy, simple slave came into view to show that slavery was not bad, that it was an enjoyable and benevolent act. The reality of slavery, of course, was not what was painted. According to Encyclopedia of Virginia, 12.5 million Africans were stolen from their homeland between the years of 1500 and 1886. Of that, 1.8 million Africans died en route. Africans were stripped of their names, languages, and humanities, forced onto a new, already colonized land or colonizing land, and made to work under duress. Men, women, and children alike were raped. Postcards illustrated Black babies as alligator bait. According to History.com, freedom fighters like Nat Turner after death were dismembered and distributed out as souvenirs. And a range of other forms of physical and mental torture took place. Bottom line, the harsh realities of slavery couldn't be hidden for long. So, post-Civil War, angry enslavers returned to other narratives.
Racial stereotypes about former enslaved people are suddenly now the laziest people in the world, and they don't want to work, and et cetera, et cetera. And those same stereotypes developed about other people, and but it was especially painfully ironic that it was said about African Americans, because just a few decades ago, scientists told us about how hardworking this or that people were, and now we're being told that they have a propensity to be lazy, or propensity to steal, or whatever else.
Enter the minstrel. Outside of literature, minstrel shows are considered the first form of mass entertainment. Creator T.D. Rice performs these shows in front of rich and poor whites alike. Darkening his skin and overdrawing his lips, Rice would speak in broken English meant to represent Black people and how they talk, and exaggerate his movements to the point of buffoonery. The three parts of a minstrel show were part one, where white men in blackface sat around and joked, perpetuating the lazy gesture. Part two, which included a variety of acts like juggling and singing, that happy go lucky and buffoon stereotype. And part three, plantation scenes to reinforce that slavery was not that bad. As these shows become more available to poor white audiences, the notion of the poorest white man can still be better than a black person really began to kick off. In the antebellum period of slavery, narratives like the happy simple slave still existed, but were also paired with caricatures like the Zip Coon, a buffoon who tries to behave like the whites and fails, showing how black people will never be able to assimilate. Jim Crow, an urban black male. If Zip Coon was northern, Jim Crow could be urban or southern. He was a black male who knew his role. He comes from the song with the same name with the following lines. Will about and turn and sow. Every time I jump Jim Crow. He was a simple, docile man. He avoided work. He had pleasures of food and dance and song. He was childlike and loyal. There's an audio with the clip. We care not what the white folks say. They can't get us to run away. He evolves into Sambo, a non threatening black man who is inferior, a happy slave, and was created to be a defense of slavery. Uncle Tom is a Christian slave in which Christianity made him docile. The Mammy is a desexualized black woman, the caregiver. She's larger and darker. She's made to be unattractive so as to not be a threat to the household, and she is also another defense of slavery. The Pickaninny, a black child who was unkept and always up to trouble, and the tragic mulatto mulatta, a result of rape or interracial coupling, somewhat sexual but had deep psychological issues because of their heritage. They did not know where to fit in. They can sometimes pass for white and do. We have Uncle Remus, who's a cousin to Uncle Tom. He's kind of naive but tries to show that he's philosophical and fails. And the Gesture, the comic buffoon. Post-antebellum period, there are caricatures like Nat, the rebellious black male who fought against the system. The brute, he's violent and overtly so. We have the buck, who's hypersexual and lusted after white women and is kind of adjacent to the brute. We have the wench, or the Jezebel, the oversexed and hypersexual black woman. Aunt Jemima, she's a predecessor to Mammy. She's a servant and happy to be, but not a slave. We have the super black man who comes from blaxploitation era. He also connects to the violent brute and hyposexual buck. You have the sapphire, who's an emasculating shrew. They put their men in their place. They didn't take crap and is the predecessor to the angry black woman. We see this in shows like Amos and Andy and Sanford and Son. We have the thug or the gangster, kind of a subgenre of that hip hop era to show the hardships of living in poverty. We have the DL who got connected to black men and men of color. They were accused of spreading HIV and were really demonized. We have the matriarch, a black mother in a black household who is a bad black mother. She's single, she works a lot, she's not at home, she couldn't take care of her kids, she's very aggressive. This caricature basically emasculates and unfeminizes the black woman. We have the welfare queen or mother, who's also considered a bad mother. She doesn't work, she's dependent on the system to take care of her and her lot. She's just content to collect a check. We have the black everyman, a non-threatening black man who could be placed in situations every man could deal with, kind of adjacent to the exceptional Negro. We have black outlaws, similar to the super black male, the anti-hero, or the rebels. The black provocator who used comedy to provoke in a non-threatening way. The black father, a black family man. You can think Cliff Huxtable or Bernie Mac or Phil from Fresh Prince. We have the Black Yoda or the Magical Negro, a very wise helper to the white protagonist in reaching their goals. All right, I just threw a lot at you. Now, let's take a look at some examples. These and other caricatures are explored in the 1986 documentary Ethnic Notions, as well as the 1991 documentary Color Adjustment, of which I will be pulling from both. Ethnic Notions speaks of the film Birth of a Nation, which captured on film the caricatures of Black people after emancipation. Whites in blackface pursue white virgins and portray the Ku Klux Klan as heroic saviors of the South, defending it from northern carpetbaggers and savage blacks. This incites and justifies racial violence in real life. Birth of a Nation quite literally rebirthed the KKK, which had somewhat, or if not completely, died out in the mid 1800s due to governmental suppression. The film, however, gave any remaining chapters a way in to align themselves with that savior complex. With the introduction of television, it's common to see Black people only in comedies. Cartoons also provide the projection of racial caricatures by showing physical distortion and violence as comical. This was done to shape impressionable young minds to view stereotypes as funny and acceptable. Cartoons also popularized the notion of Black savagery. Africa was the dark continent, and the grace of slavery and segregation civilized Black people, and they would revert to savages without the superiority of white people to keep them in their place. Something else to mention is the notion of black is ugly, especially in cartoons. There's this push that European and those closer to it are more feminine, refined, and beautiful. Africans and African Americans being compared to these standards are not feminine or refined. They're big-lipped, gangly, loud, grotesque savages. Now, there is such a thing as a noble savage who is true to themselves and fights for a cause, but at the end of the day, they're still a savage. The jazz singer pushed these narratives as well, and Gone with the Wind would also promote the simple, happy slave. And marketing, Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben reinforced these stereotypes earlier mentioned about servitude. According to Color Adjustment, Amos and Andy, originally a radio program featuring two white actors doing blackface, becomes the first television program to feature two black actors as leads. In this program, Amos and Andy would get up to all kinds of antics to show the mental inferiority of black people. Every character either acts buffoonish or crookedly, and it perpetuates the notion that all Black people act this way. We also get to this point where it's not just white people perpetuating these things. Black people in the creative arts knew that they had to break in somehow, even if breaking in meant doing blackface. Yes, Black people did blackface, and it was a catch-22. For the most part, this form of entertainment was a door out of hunger, the South, and into opportunities, but that came at the cost of one's dignity. Even those who tried to humanize their blackface caricatures, like Burt Reynolds, would still be demeaned, and their careers would always carry the stain of minstrel. As for Amos and Andy, it was boycotted by the NAACP and was eventually canceled after 2 seasons. At this time, World War I was stirring up, bringing hope for Black people as a veteran would be a respectable member of society. Unfortunately, these caricatures were spread globally in one way or another, and many Black people who joined the Army would find themselves victims to overt and casual racism, both at home and across the seas while serving. During and after World War II, these caricatures would fade away and be replaced with others. Enter the exceptional Negro. According to Color Adjustment in 1955, around 66% of US homes have television. Watching TV as a family becomes more of a thing, and as Black people break out of comedy, they must act accordingly and civilly to keep that white acceptance. They must be people that could be allowed to enter white homes. One such person was Nat King Cole. Not just a famous musician, Cole would be the first Black person to host a variety TV show that was nationally broadcast. Not only was he safe from most white homes, but Black people could also take pride in his show, which featured serious musical acts and interviews, not being rooted in humor or comedy. For white audiences, he represented a Black person who could assimilate. For Black audiences, he was someone who was refined and didn't play into the buffoonery of earlier Black entertainers. The Nat King Cole show would unfortunately be canceled after 1 season, as his airing also coincided with the beginning of mass integration in the South. So, TV being a sponsored medium, never willing to buy or sell things that could lead to controversy, couldn't find a sponsor for Cole in the South, and he would have to go. As the civil rights era begins to take place, it challenges the stereotypes of the past as well as the status quo of the time. The reality of the abuse and violence Black people suffered will begin to raise questions about how they were viewed in the media. Further fueling these questions was the show East Side, West Side, which challenged the notion of the American dream. This show followed several different storylines every episode, and most didn't have a happy ending. Unlike other shows that may have resolved any issues by the end of the episode, this show focused on the reality of integrating with a society that covertly and openly still had biases towards them, and it rocked the status quo. As 90% of US homes have TVs by 1963, this show's undercutting the myth of American progress would lead to its cancellation after 1 season. The question it posed would, however, lead the brand of TV to trying something different. Enter Julia. Played by Diane Carroll, a respectable Black person, Julia was a nurse with a family and an education. She lived in an integrated environment, but she didn't present a picture of being overtly grateful or the grinning, subservient domestic. For all intents purposes, she belonged there. Gone were the extreme caricatures of old, as a brutal reality of American racism made those happy slave images ring hollow. Of course, caricatures weren't eradicated, but instead morphed into others. Because although Julia was certainly an improvement and one Black people could take pride in, She was completely removed of her race. There are no mentions of it. She would be a white Negro, assimilated and comfortable with whiteness, but removed from her own identity. To be clear, no, she didn't have to be defined by her heritage, but neither should it be completely removed from the story. And because that was the burden of being in primetime slots at this time, you represented your race. So to be so far removed from it represented a failure, rather a disappointment, as the reality of Black people being so closely tied to their race in a segregated America was ever present. Also, there is no husband or father in the picture, so now her son is fatherless and she's single. That does perpetuate the absent father stereotype. So while the start still flawed, and of course, nothing is going to be flawless, but there will be medias where the flaws are not so noticeable. In the 1970s, this brings I Spy. Now, I understand he is rightfully out of favor now, but Bill Cosby's legacy in media cannot and will not be denied. I Spy featured one of the first black-white cop duos, otherwise considered a Huck Finn fixation. While his race is still removed from the story and that it's not an issue for the characters, it also showed the black guy as the cool action hero. Unlike the blaxploitation films of the 70s, which kind of play into the brute stereotype, Cosby's character was cool because he was suave and an action hero. Speaking of the blaxploitation films, yes, they do play into the sexed up brute Jezebel stereotypes more than they should, but they also have a place in the evolution of Black people's place in the media because now we're not just serious actors, we're action stars. These films feature Black men and women alike kicking butt, taking names, and sticking it to the man. For all their faults, and there were many, they were the first of their kind, and it showed that Black people could be action heroes and desirable sexual beings in their own right. This time also brings ghetto sitcoms like Sanford and Son, Good Times, What's Happening, That's My Mama. While perhaps loved by many Black people at the time and even today, I know they're some of my favorites. Their faults were that they showed impoverished neighborhoods as survivable places. While many Black families did survive in these neighborhoods, it was not always easy, and it wasn't as easy as it was portrayed on TV. All in the Family, though centered on a white family, also pushes the bounds on race subjects. Instead of being family TV meant to entertain and distract from real world issues, it strived to show a family as a real world family with a racist father, a more inclined mother, and a liberal daughter and son in law. And while it did push the bounds, it still reinforced the notion of no matter what, including racist ideologies, family bonds remain intact through humor getting resolved. All in the Family. Its spin-off, The Jeffersons, would see a Black man not thriving in the ghettos of America, instead moving up to the east side to that deluxe apartment in the sky. Weezy and George Jefferson and their son Lionel had made it, somewhat. The Jeffersons were even neighbors with Helen, a Black woman, and her husband Thomas, a white man, further challenging the status quo around consensual interracial relationships and couplings. George even has his own thriving business, a laundromat that he is proud of. Now, whatever the implications about a Black man having his own business and it being a laundry service, perhaps the biggest issue with this show is his dynamic with his maid Florence. Now, on his own, George is a bit of a hothead and low key, somewhat sometimes resembles that dancing Negro. But Florence is every bit the sassy sapphire, never taking mess from George and always back talking. While that doesn't inherently sound bad, because George was talking at the side of his neck to her sometimes, it really just depends on how you do it. And their entire dynamic relied on the sapphire trope. And we also see this dynamic between Fred Sanford and his sister Esther and Sanford and Son. Movie-wise, the 70s also brought the semi-parody Western Blazing Saddles and blaxploitation horror films like Blackula and Blackenstein. Blazing Saddles, while provocative in that it showed the irony of racist and homophobic ideologies, was still based on that Huck Finn fixation. Blackenstein, Blackula, and its sequels were blaxploitation, but I'll get to those when I discuss the horror genre. Speaking of Westerns, did Black people exist in them? I mean, in real life, yes. In fact, 1 out of 3 to 4 cowboys were Black. Notably, Mary Fields, dubbed Stagecoach Mary, was the first Black woman to work a route mail carrier. She carried a rifle with her and was not afraid to use it. William Bill Pickett invented the sport of steer wrestling. Henrietta Aunt Reedy Williams Foster, while enslaved, was said to be able to ride horses, side saddle, and bareback better than any man. Nat Love, a former enslaved person, wrote his own autobiography entitled The Adventures of Nat Love, better known in cattle country as Deadwood Dick. And Bass Reeves was the first Black U.S. deputy marshal west of the Mississippi, having over 3,000 arrests under his belt. Not only that, but when you see that picture of the shot of the horse jockey running on the images, so the images all moving together to make a picture, that's a Black cowboy. And according to the documentary High Horses, the Black Cowboy, even the term cowboy, which derives from the Spanish word Vaqueros, I did not practice that, I apologize, was once derogatorily used for black cowhands. Their white counterparts were cowhands while they were cowboys. But when we get to media, they're either outlaws or runaway slaves or field hands. Ironic considering the Lone Ranger is based off of Bass Reeves. And it wouldn't be until the 1960s with films like Duel at Diablo and the Rat Pack Western Sergeants and TV shows like The Rifleman that brought back the black cowboy interview. Perhaps one of the most notable and defining pieces of media in the 1970s, however, is Alex Haley's Roots. This miniseries followed a family's journey from capture in Africa, slavery in the Americas, and overall survival and freedom after the fact. The problem, the story is almost like an underdog overcoming a grand trial. Roots captured American audiences, but also could be viewed as a family moving or integrating to America, coming out of their brutal trial mostly unscathed and assimilated, and ending with a positive image of Black success reaching the promised land, according to Color Adjustment. The 1980s roll in, bringing wild hair, colorful makeup, and gimme a break. Nell Carter stars as Nell Harper. She works for Chief Carl Kansky at his house as a live-in housekeeper and a semi-nanny. She doesn't play into the mammy or the happy slave, but she is still reminiscent of those past stereotypes. But where she fell was The Cosby Show must succeed, right? The Cosby Show projects the image of a successful black family. Cliff is a doctor, Claire is a lawyer. Their five kids all try to find their place in the world and do so in a loving two-parent household. The Huxtables were living the American dream in a post-civil rights era in America. And perhaps that was its fault. Yes, they were respectable, and yes, they acknowledged the hardships of real life, like airing Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, but why that speech and not one of his many others condemning racial violence of the time? Now, that might sound counterintuitive. You get a positive representation, and it's still not enough. But compare this to Frank's Place, a show that offered a broader range of the times. While the network wanted it to be a comedy, even winning for Outstanding Comedy in 1988, the show wanted to be much more serious. It discussed topics like the brown paper bag test and issues of racism. The show, at a time where TV was meant to be simple entertainment, a distraction from reality, proved too real for Americans. It also couldn't find a time slot on TV and was canceled after one season. Again, that's not to say that The Cosby Show doesn't have its place or that it's viewed as a racial failure, but with that level of success comes hardships, and it's not a bad thing if Black audiences felt that the Huxtables could have been more connected to their culture or the struggle that got them there. Movie-wise, we get Beverly Hills Cops and Lethal Weapon in the late 1980s. While Beverly Hills Cops has some redeeming qualities, Lethal Weapon wasn't always the greatest. Unlike the action films of the 70s, the black character in this wasn't the cool guy anymore. By the 1990s, we get another black family that had made it in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. The Bankses were a respectable black family living in the suburbs of California. Will Smith, cousin to the Bankses, moves in with them trying to find his place. This show was a comedy, but also had serious episodes tackling racial profiling, an absentee father, gun violence, and etc. So what's the issue here? Perhaps a bit personal, but I will say the biggest flaw in this show, one of the biggest flaws in this show was that the banks were heavily involved in the civil rights era, only to end up becoming Republicans and a Reagan administration. In the very first episode, Philip tells Will how he heard Malcolm X speak. He and Vivian took part in several civil rights marches and demonstrations. There's even an episode, and I don't know if it's like a canon episode or if it was just a one-off episode, but there's an episode showing how, showing when they were poor and they lived all in a tiny cramped apartment, only to finally make it, excuse me, only to finally to make it, but now their kids are so far removed from that life that Hillary is just running around, Daddy, I need money. Ashley is cooler, but she also is very privileged. Like, I don't know how I feel about her going to public schools. The whole episode about her going to the public school. And Carlton is like his disdain for liberals is preyed up for labs. And there's nothing wrong with providing your kids with that level of privilege, but it gets to a point. But that whole notion of making it and then becoming conservative can seep into the black capitalism conversation and how black capitalism won't save the black community. And that's a whole other topic that I'm not fully equipped to talk about at this time. Another major issue was the recasting of Vivian, once played by dark-skinned actress Janet Hubert before being replaced by lighter-skinned actress Daphne Maxwell Reid. The recasting is largely considered a the biggest colorism issue in Black TV, or one of the biggest colorism issues in Black TV. Outside of the skin tone, there are also still very clear, noticeable differences between the two. Vivian was outspoken, while Maxwell Reed's was more reserved. Intentional or not, this perpetuates the stereotype about darker skinned Black women being more aggressive or assertive than their lighter skinned counterparts. Other sitcoms of the 90s, late 90s, and early 2000s include A Different World, Living Single, The Parenthood, and Live in Color, Martin, The Jamie Foxx Show, Sister Sister, Moesha and it spun off The Parkers, Girlfriends, Half and Half, My Wife and Kids, and The Bernie Mac Show. All classics. All these are comedies or sometimes dramedies that allow Black characters to be humorous without being buffoonish. Well, most of the times. While The Parkers has its comedic moments and is definitely the better show to Moesha, to me, it also heavily portrays the desperate, male-obsessed, plus-size Black woman. For Westerns, the film like Posse follows a group of former Buffalo soldiers and one white soldier who must defeat their former commander. This film is really an homage to many Black cowboys whose stories were being untold at the time. Again, as I said earlier, one in four cowboys were Black. Another Western of the time, and one of my unironic favorites, is the film The Wild Wild West, starring Will Smith as Jim West. Now, does this film have its issues? For sure, and I'll come back to the character of Rita later in the series. However, being a fan of the original, you can't convince me it's worse than the original, which was quite silly sometimes. Making Jim West black, it's one of the best movie decisions like ever. Dramas like Bad Boys continue to show Black characters as awesome heroes while also being family men. New Jack City, on the other hand, is a commentary piece that delves into the drug epidemic and how it can be propelled by people within the community, and its effects that has on the community. Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society also provoke thought about gang violence and the poverty and how that can force a person into it. And so, on first glance, they may seem like thuggish movies perpetuating the brute stereotype, and maybe one can make an argument about why they low key do. But more than that, they offer a complex look into these realities. And this continues in the early 2010s with shows like Power and Empire. Now, I will stop there, rounding out this episode of Black People's Place in Comedies, Dramas, and Westerns. If you like this episode, be sure to like this episode, leave comments down below, and let me know what you found interesting in this video. Be respectful. We can have a conversation with one another, but only if we are respectful. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and stick around for the next episode when we get into race and its effects on the indigenous community.